The end of the First World War left Germany in ruins. Although its territory was barely invaded, the conditions imposed by the victorious powers were seen as total humiliation. The treaty signed in June 1919 forced Germany to accept the blame for the war, give up territory, reduce its army to minimal levels, and pay large sums of money it did not have. The German government had collapsed in November 1918. It began with mutinies in northern ports, where sailors and workers rebelled. This pushed the emperor to abdicate and flee. In his place, a makeshift republic was created, led by social democratic leaders trying to maintain control amid the chaos. This republic would become known as the Weimar Republic because its new constitution was approved there. From day one, this republic had enemies everywhere. The military, monarchists, and right-wing politicians never accepted its existence. For them, surrendering and signing the treaty was a betrayal. They invented the idea that the German army had not been defeated on the battlefield but betrayed by politicians. This story became very popular among nationalists and was used for years to attack the new rulers. The economy collapsed immediately. The war had left the country without money and with many debts. To pay what the victors demanded, the government began printing banknotes without control. This triggered inflation that no one could stop. By 1923, $1 was worth billions of marks. Wages lost value within hours. Buying bread was a race against time. Lifelong savings vanished in days. The anguish was total. In the middle of this disaster, armed groups appeared everywhere. Communist groups wanted to repeat what had happened in Russia. In several cities, they tried to seize power. At the same time, ex-soldiers formed right-wing militias that attacked strikers and killed left-wing politicians. One of the most active were the Freikorps, composed of veterans who despised democracy and dreamed of restoring the empire. The streets became war zones. There were assassinations, attacks, and uprisings all the time. Ministers, judges, union leaders, and businessmen were targets of attacks. In this environment, many began to look back nostalgically at the old imperial times. For them, the Republic only brought chaos and insecurity, and they had reasons to think so. The army had been reduced by the treaty. They could only have 100,000 soldiers. This was not even enough to protect the borders. The police could not cope. In many regions, armed groups or local authorities were in control. The state was weak, and it showed. The new political system had voting for everyone, a parliament and modern rules. But it didn't work well. There were too many parties, no one could achieve a majority, and governments lasted very little. People saw that democracy solved nothing. The victorious powers did not leave. Foreign troops occupied parts of the country, such as the Ruhr, and monitored that Germany complied with the treaty. This generated more anger among the population. The right-wing press used these events to talk about humiliation and betrayal. In this situation, groups that had previously been seen as crazy began to gain attention. Their extreme ideas started to sound less strange. They spoke of nationalism, anti-Semitism, a strong hand, and national pride. One of these groups was called the German Workers' Party. It was small but very noisy. They met in beer halls and talked about reclaiming the country. To one of these meetings came a former soldier named Adolf Hitler. He had fought at the front without notable achievements, but he spoke loudly and knew how to connect with people. The group's leaders noticed him. In a short time, he became their main speaker. His speech mixed hatred, blame, and promises of revenge. He said that Jews, communists, and politicians had destroyed Germany, and many believed him. This small party changed its name and became the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It was still a minority, but the ground was ready. The Republic could not provide order or food. People were afraid and seeking answers. Among the ruins of 1919, the movement that would change everything began to grow. The awakening of National Socialism. After the chaos of the post-war period, the German Workers' Party was just one of many small groups that appeared in Munich. By the end of 1919, they numbered no more than 50 people. Their plan was to gather workers who were fed up with both Marxism and the traditional system. One of its members was Adolf Hitler, a former soldier who had been sent by the army to spy on extremist movements. Hitler attended a party meeting for the first time in September of that year. He listened to the ideas, argued with one of the speakers, and drew attention. The group's leader, Anton Drexler, invited him to join. Hitler accepted. He was a man without direction, no steady job, no education, no family. but he had a talent for public speaking that soon made him the group's main agitator. In 1920, the party decided to change its name. It became the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It was a strange mix of nationalist and social ideas. The name was designed to attract workers, but also patriots and former soldiers. They chose as their symbol a black swastika on a white and red background, the colors of the old empire. That same year, they released a program with 25 points. They called for the unity of all Germans, the annulment of the Treaty of Versailles, more land for the people, an end to immigration, and the expulsion of Jews. They wanted a strong state, free of corruption, with no free press and no foreign capitalism. They mixed anti-Semitic, racist, and authoritarian ideas with popular demands. The group remained small, but it gained visibility in Munich. Hitler became the main speaker. He filled beer halls with fiery speeches. He attacked communists, Jews, politicians, and businessmen. He promised to restore pride, punish traitors, and rescue the fatherland. His style was aggressive and theatrical. He used his body, voice, and gestures to excite the audience. In 1921, Hitler managed to take full control of the party. He imposed himself on his internal rivals and demanded complete obedience. He wanted to decide everything: the program, the allies, the direction. For that, he needed a shock group. He created it with former soldiers and violent youths. It was called the Storm Detachment, or SA. Their job was to protect Nazi meetings and disrupt those of rivals. The SA wore brown shirts and acted like an army. They beat communists, interrupted events, and marched in order. Many were frustrated ex-soldiers without jobs looking for action. For them, the party was a way to continue the fight. Hitler used them to show strength and create fear. They also gave him an image of order amid general chaos. Between 1921 and 1923, the party grew rapidly. They began publishing their own newspaper, Der Völkische Beobachter. It was sensationalist, full of attacks and rumors. It helped spread the Nazi message among workers, merchants, and soldiers. Inflation, unemployment, and instability made many people listen carefully. Hitler was not the only extremist active. There were paramilitary groups everywhere. Some were Bavarian separatists, others monarchists. Many just wanted to overthrow the Berlin government. The climate in Munich was tense. The police tolerated right-wing radicals and pursued leftists. This allowed Hitler to move freely. In 1923, the situation worsened. French troops occupied the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. The government responded passively. Inflation soared even more. The mark was worth less than the paper it was printed on. Wages lost value in hours. Food was scarce. Many blamed the politicians and the system. Hitler believed his moment had come. He decided to copy Mussolini's model, who a year earlier had marched on Rome with his black shirts. Hitler planned a similar action, a show of force from Munich to take Berlin, but he lacked the means and sufficient support. On November 8, 1923, Hitler and about 600 armed men entered a beer hall where the governor of Bavaria was speaking. They surrounded him, forced him to declare his support, and took control of the place. It was the start of the Munich Putsch. The next day, they marched through the streets with the idea of seizing power. But the police blocked them. There was a brief shootout. 16 Nazis and 4 officers died. Hitler was arrested. From prison to political strategy. After his arrest, Adolf Hitler received a 5-year sentence, although he only spent a few months in a cell with amenities. He used this confinement to write a book in which he laid out his complete political vision, titled Mein Kampf. There he expressed his rejection of the parliamentary system, his ambition for a powerful Germany, and his hatred of Jews and Marxists. From prison, Hitler realized that another violent attempt would not work. Therefore, when he was released in 1924, he began to change the movement's strategy. His plan was to gain power by using existing rules. He wanted to turn the Nazi Party into a legal and strong force, using votes instead of weapons. Although he was still a man seeking total control, he now pursued it through legal means. The Nazi Party was divided after the failed coup. Some followers wanted to continue the direct street fight. Others no longer trusted him. Hitler, however, took absolute command of the party from the moment he was released. To ensure that no one challenged his power, he created clear rules within the party. No member could criticize his orders, and he was the only one deciding the path to follow. In 1925, the Nazi Party was completely reorganized. Adolf Hitler imposed a vertical structure. He was at the top with full control. Below him, he placed intermediate leaders who answered only to him. The paramilitary group that had previously been scattered, called the SAA, was reactivated and placed at the party's direct service, not as an autonomous group, but as a pressure and street force arm. That same year, Mein Kampf was published and sold as a kind of political guide for those who shared his ideas. Although it sold few copies initially, over time it became essential material to understand his thinking. Nothing was hidden. He openly spoke of his plan to eliminate the Jews, his desire to conquer territories in the East, and his intention to overthrow the party system. Joseph Goebbels, who had initially been closer to radical socialists, joined the Nazi Party and was dazzled by the way Adolf Hitler spoke. From the moment he heard him live, he decided there was no other possible leader. Goebbels began using propaganda as a key tool to attract young people, the unemployed, and war veterans. He turned speeches, pamphlets, and symbols into weapons as effective as the fists of the SA. Meanwhile, Heinrich Himmler began to stand out for his discipline, fanaticism, and ability to control internal structures. He rose within the movement until he took command of a new and more loyal group, the SS. This force was created as a special unit responding only to Hitler, more closed, more obedient, and with a vision of purity far more extreme than the SA. During the following years, the party grew slowly. In the 1924 elections, they won only a few seats in parliament, and then their numbers fell even further. Many thought the movement was finished. But Hitler was not discouraged. He maintained control with an iron fist and focused on expanding into the regions. He created a network of local leaders who spread the message door to door, in villages, factories, universities, and among retired soldiers. The party relied on mass events to reinforce its image. Rallies filled with flags, torches, and martial music became part of the Nazi style. Every act was designed to leave a strong impression on the public's memory. Goebbels knew this and exploited it. Unlike other parties, the Nazis did not offer complex programs. They offered enemies, strength, and a leader who said exactly what many wanted to hear. In 1928, they participated in the elections again. Although they won only 12 seats, they used this small advance to show that they were back. That was the sign that the party, though small, was still alive. Meanwhile, the country's economic situation worsened, unemployment grew, and confidence in traditional parties collapsed. Foreign aid that had arrived with the Dawes Plan was no longer secure. Many economists warned that dependence on foreign loans was a ticking time bomb. In 1929, that bomb exploded. The stock market crash in the United States dragged down German banks. In a few months, thousands of businesses closed, unemployment rose like never before, and food lines lengthened. Desperation was felt in every neighborhood. It was at that moment that Hitler's message began to resonate more strongly. While traditional parties debated without reaching agreements, he presented himself as the only firm figure. In his speeches, he did not offer technical solutions. He shouted, pointed out culprits, and promised that the true Germans would reclaim the country. The crisis provided the perfect stage for his growth. Joseph Goebbels intensified his propaganda work. He used unemployment, misery, and fear as constant material for his messages. Every leaflet depicted a betrayed people, a rotten system, and a future possible only with Adolf Hitler at the helm. The images were direct: hunger lines, sad faces, ruined workers. The party promised work, pride, security, and punishment for traitors. At the same time, businessmen began to pay attention to the movement. Although they did not fully share its violence or racial ideas, they saw in Hitler someone capable of stopping the communists. Large industrialists, like Fritz Thyssen, began financing the party. They wanted a check on chaos, a strong figure, someone who would end strikes and protect property. Hitler, without abandoning his radical discourse, began moderating some aspects to gain their support. The party also changed the way it organized itself. It created sections by age, profession, and region. Youth had their own group with activities and indoctrination. Women, too. Courses, excursions, and celebrations were organized, all aimed at creating identity. Each member was part of a machinery that functioned with discipline and obedience. Local leaders received direct orders from Munich, where the party's operations center was located. The SA continued to expand. By 1929, it had tens of thousands of members. Although the police monitored them, they operated freely in many areas. They beat opponents, disrupted rival events, and protected the party's gatherings. In several cities, they functioned as a parallel force. They were feared, and at the same time seen by some sectors as guarantors of order amidst chaos. Hitler's figure gained absolute prominence. He decided every step. No one spoke without his approval or questioned his decisions. Goebbels portrayed him as a guide. In posters, his face occupied the center. At rallies, his voice dominated the scene. The idea that only he could rescue the country was repeated without pause. The party's social base also grew. If at the beginning it mainly attracted war veterans and small shopkeepers, it now included unemployed workers, ruined peasants, and youth without a future. The message was simple. They were victims of a corrupt elite and internal enemies. The party presented itself as a movement of the people with discipline and direction. The electoral leap to power. In September 1930, the National Socialist German Workers' Party made an unexpected breakthrough. It went from 12 seats to 107 in parliament. It became the second largest group behind the Social Democratic Party. That election showed that Adolf Hitler's speeches had resonated with a significant part of the population. The impact of the economic crisis and massive unemployment was reflected directly at the ballot box. Joseph Goebbels led an intense campaign. They filled cities with posters, organized street events, and used radios and loudspeakers. They presented Hitler as a strong man, someone capable of giving answers when everyone else was silent. The rallies were enormous, with flags, uniforms, and coordinated salutes. Every detail was meant to show order, strength, and direction. Factories closed, banks went bankrupt, and poverty grew. Many Germans saw that the system no longer worked. Adolf Hitler did not talk about technical plans. He promised justice, punishment for those responsible, and a great country once again. The message was simple and direct. It required no explanation. One just needed to listen and decide. The SA intensified their actions. They protected party events, patrolled neighborhoods, and attacked political rivals. The police, overwhelmed or indifferent, intervened little. In many towns, the group acted with total freedom. Its membership increased, many unemployed young people seeking belonging. The elites began to take notice. Some businessmen and bankers saw in the party a useful force against communism. Fritz Thyssen himself drew closer. Money channels, private meetings, and discreet agreements were opened. For Hitler, it was enough that they did not stop him. Gaining influence was the next step. Paul von Hindenburg, the president, did not sympathize with Hitler. He saw him as an agitator, an opportunist without training, but he also understood that the country was collapsing. The elections showed that traditional parties could no longer sustain a stable government. From then on, governance by decree began. Heinrich Brüning, the chancellor at the time, tried to contain the crisis by cutting spending and raising taxes. His decisions made the recession feel stronger. Discontent grew, his political support decreased, and his measures produced no visible results. Hitler exploited this wear and tear. During 1931, the National Socialist Party expanded its territorial network. Local offices, youth centers, and women's groups increased. Membership campaigns were daily. In towns, messages spread through radio or party spokespeople. In cities, parades were common. Goebbels was in charge of the content. He wrote bulletins, directed the party press, and spoke at mass events. He portrayed Hitler as a man of destiny, a chosen one who would bring stability. At the same time, he pointed out the guilty: Marxists, Jews, foreigners, traitors. The language was aggressive, direct, without nuance. In July 1932, new elections were held. The party received more than 13 million votes. They won 230 seats. Now they were the largest force in parliament. This result confirmed that they were no longer a marginal minority. Adolf Hitler demanded the position of chancellor. He wanted full power. President Hindenburg refused. He appointed Franz von Papen as the new chancellor. He had no party of his own and governed without a parliamentary majority. It was an unpopular decision. Hitler did not accept being sidelined. He organized more rallies, challenged the government, and mobilized the SA. Tension grew each week. Von Papen dissolved parliament and called for new elections in November 1932. Hitler's party lost 2 million votes, but still retained 196 seats. They remained first. The communists also gained. Polarization was evident. Hermann Göring was elected president of the parliament. From that position, he blocked several government measures. He controlled the agenda and used the office to hinder his opponents. Von Papen resigned. Kurt von Schleicher took his place. He tried to split the National Socialist Party by offering positions to some of its members. The strategy failed. Hitler did not allow fractures. He showed total control over his organization. He rejected all approaches. He wanted the chancellorship or nothing. Contacts between the party and conservative sectors increased. Some businessmen, military officers and politicians saw Hitler as useful if contained. They thought that once in government they could manage him. They saw him as a vehicle to restore order, not a real threat. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler received the official appointment from Paul von Hindenburg. The meeting took place at the presidential residence. Franz von Papen and Otto Meissner were also present. The decree was signed that same morning. The ceremony was brief. The new government consisted mostly of conservative figures. Wilhelm Frick took the Ministry of the Interior. Hermann Göring received the Prussian Interior portfolio. Franz von Papen was appointed vice-chancellor. Alfred Hugenberg took charge of the economy. The rest were trusted allies of Hindenburg and the traditional right. Only 3 cabinet members belonged to the National Socialist Party. The rest came from conservative parties and the state apparatus. Von Papen's idea was simple: use Hitler to curb the labor movement and restore order without giving him real decision-making power. They saw him as a useful but manageable figure. The appointment met no institutional resistance. The armed forces accepted the decision. Businessmen expressed approval. Some even sent letters of support. In Berlin, the streets filled with uniformed militants. Torch and drum marches were organized. The government-aligned press spoke of a new beginning. Goebbels drafted the first communiqué. It spoke of a necessary change, of moral cleansing and of national recovery. The tone was aggressive, with calls for unity under firm leadership. It was distributed in thousands of copies across the country. Party newspapers reproduced it without edits. From day one, the new cabinet acted quickly. Several workers' demonstrations were banned. Left-wing publications were censored. In some regions, trade union activists were detained. The police received orders to collaborate with the SA. Göring coordinated these actions from Prussia, bypassing parliament. Franz von Papen held meetings with businessmen and diplomats. He assured them the situation was under control, promising stability, investments, and social peace. He claimed Hitler had no personal majority and that real power lay with the president and conservative ministers. He denied any radical plans. Adolf Hitler summoned the cabinet to nearly daily sessions. He listened to everyone but set the pace and topics. He avoided long discussions, demanding speed and loyalty. He spoke firmly, using long silences and direct gazes. Frick and Göring obeyed without objection. Other ministers began to notice his control. Hugenberg tried to block some decisions, proposing moderate economic measures. Hitler ignored him, preferring to act through decrees and public announcements. Goebbels disseminated the decisions before they were even discussed in the cabinet, a way to set the course without waiting for consensus. The tactic worked. The SA increased its presence in key cities, organizing patrols, intimidating political rivals, and occupying public buildings. Local authorities offered no resistance. Göring ordered the police to cooperate or stay out of the way. Many officers sympathized with the party, others feared reprisals. A new propaganda office was created, led by Goebbels from Berlin. It controlled posters, leaflets, radio broadcasts, and newspaper articles. The message was uniform: order, work, unity, and discipline. Technical topics were avoided. Short phrases, strong images, and recognizable symbols were used. In the first 15 days of the new government, 30 decrees were approved. Most affected civil rights, controlled the press, or allowed detention without a court order. The goal was clear: eliminate opponents, reinforce internal control, and consolidate the power structure. Center and right-wing parties offered no resistance. Some thought they could restrain Hitler from within. Others trusted Hindenburg to use his authority to limit any excesses. No one acted decisively. Trade unions were disoriented. The left was divided. On February 13th, the parliament was dissolved and new elections were called for March. Hitler wanted a personal majority. He launched a massive campaign, traveling across the country by plane, speaking in stadiums, squares, stations, and factories. Rallies were daily, always with the same staging. Goebbels organized night parades, concerts, and radio broadcasts. Cities were filled with posters featuring Hitler's image. He presented himself as the national savior, saying the country had to choose between chaos or order. The tone was aggressive but effective. Public response grew steadily. On March 4th, Goering led a massive raid in Berlin. Hundreds of communists, socialists, and government critics were arrested. Left-wing press offices were closed, printing presses, radios, and pamphlets were seized. It was justified as a preventive measure against possible sabotage. On February 27th, the Parliament building was set on fire. The police arrested a young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe. Hitler and Goering used the incident as a pretext, claiming it was part of a larger plan to seize power. An emergency decree was drafted and signed the next day. It suspended individual rights, authorized detention without trial, and allowed police intervention in any state. It was applied nationwide and marked the first legal step toward dictatorship. The government acted without delay. Franz von Papen did not protest. Alfred Hugenberg supported the measure. Paul von Hindenburg signed without objection. Only a few judges expressed doubts, but no one listened. Power was concentrated. Hitler ceased being just chancellor and began controlling the state's repressive apparatus. Business leaders offered economic support for the March elections, raising funds, organizing events, and publishing advertisements in favor of the party. They demanded no conditions, only stability and protection against communism. Hitler promised both: dictatorship in motion, control, and propaganda. On March 5, 1933, Germany went back to the polls. Hitler's party sought an absolute majority to secure control of the parliament. In the midst of the campaign, the Reichstag fire allowed the application of the presidential decree that suspended civil rights. Communists were persecuted harshly. Many candidates were excluded from the race, and others could not even appear in public. On voting day, the streets were full of flags, uniforms, and armed guards. The SA and the police patrolled near the polling stations. Official newspapers announced that only a total victory would bring stability. Party activists worked in shifts. They carried ballots in their hands, pressured voters, and filled the ballot boxes. The result was not as expected. Hitler's party received 43% of the votes. It was their best result so far, but it was not enough to control the parliament. Still, with the support of Alfred Hugenberg's nationalists, they managed to secure a simple majority. The communists were excluded by decree. This altered the distribution of seats. The regime began to move its pieces. On March 21st, a ceremony was held in Potsdam at the Church of the Prussian Kings. Paul von Hindenburg appeared in full-dress uniform. Hitler arrived in a dark suit and bowed before the president. The image was published on thousands of front pages. The act was meant to show unity between the old power and the new. 2 days later, on March 23rd, the parliament convened to vote on a law that completely changed the rules. The so-called Enabling Act allowed the cabinet to issue regulations with the force of law without going through the legislature. 2/3 were needed to approve it. The Social Democrats voted against it, but the rest supported it. The communists were not present. Many had been arrested, others were in hiding, and some had fled the country. The president of the parliament authorized their seats not to be counted for the quorum. The maneuver was legalized without discussion. The law was passed without obstacles. From that moment, the government could act without oversight. The communists were not present. Many had been arrested, others were in hiding, and some had fled the country. The president of the parliament authorized their seats not to be counted for the quorum. The maneuver was legalized without discussion. The law was passed without obstacles. From that moment, the government could act without oversight. Adolf Hitler did not waste time. In April, the expulsion of Jewish officials from the public administration was ordered. Opposition publications were suspended. Regional governments were taken over. In each federal state, commissioners with total powers were appointed. The country became a centralized structure. Decisions were made from Berlin. May 1st was declared National Labor Day. Parades, marches, and mass events were organized. Union leaders were invited as a show of goodwill. The next day, their offices were occupied by the SA. Leaders were arrested. Bank accounts were taken over by the new official body. The German Labour Front was created, the only organization allowed to represent workers. Its head was Robert Ley, directly subordinate to the Chancellor. Employees could no longer negotiate conditions or form unions. Strikes were prohibited. Any protest was considered an act of sabotage. The regime's propaganda presented the measures as necessary for national unity, emphasizing the idea of a united and disciplined community. In June, the remaining political parties were banned. Some dissolved voluntarily. Others were shut down by decree. Offices were closed. Funds were confiscated. Leaders came under surveillance. The country was left with a single authorized party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Youth organizations were also absorbed. The German youth movement became part of the party's youth. Sports, camps, and cultural activities came under direct supervision. Uniforms, salutes, and songs were standardized. The goal was to form a new generation with discipline and obedience. The power structure consolidated quickly. Each region had a regional party leader, each city a local chief, each neighborhood a block leader. It was a network organized by levels. Everyone depended on the supreme leader. Orders came straight down. Each level supervised the one below. The police were purged. Officers loyal to the Republic were removed. Those showing affinity with the new line were promoted. Special units were created. They were trained in interrogation techniques, mass control, and rapid detention. Prisons received new inmates every week. The Ministry of the Interior published new regulations. Lists of banned authors were included. Civil associations were eliminated. School textbooks were rewritten. Inspectors visited classrooms, libraries, and community centers. Any trace of opposition was removed. A unified image of the country was promoted. Adolf Hitler's figure began to appear in portraits, banknotes, stamps, books, albums, and collectible cards. He was portrayed as a strong leader, protector of the people, defender of the homeland. Radios repeated his voice. Speeches were broadcast nationwide. Cinemas opened screenings with government-produced newsreels. Newspapers were quickly controlled. Editors received orders from Berlin. Headlines, images, and comments were reviewed. Independent publications were closed or absorbed. Every article had to align with the official message. Radios were required to broadcast daily excerpts. The Chancellor's speeches occupied prime time. Joseph Goebbels was appointed minister in charge of controlling the content reaching the public. From his office, he reviewed scripts, supervised filming, and prepared campaigns. Media theme weeks were organized. Each message had to reinforce one idea: the new state, restored order, the internal enemy, obedience as duty. Universities were reviewed by party committees. Non-compliant teachers were dismissed. Those demonstrating commitment to the official line were promoted. Courses were adjusted. Programs changed. History was taught from a single version. Students used textbooks revised by the central office. The judicial system was restructured. Loyal judges were appointed. Regulations that hindered decrees were removed. Special courts were established to handle cases of treason, sabotage, and enemy propaganda. Hearings were fast. Sentences were handed down immediately. There was no full right to defense or appeal. The political police expanded. A central intelligence office was created. New agents were trained. Networks of informants were organized. Each neighborhood had responsible officials. Every letter was checked. Every call could be monitored. Arrests were made without a judicial order. Cells filled with detainees for political reasons. Teachers had to swear loyalty. Every principal had to report suspicious activities. School songs were replaced. Maps showed a new geography. Allowed biographies were limited to approved figures. Words, symbols, and even colors were standardized. Culture was under a single control. Doctors had to join the party organization. Healthcare was regulated. Detailed patient records were required. These lists were used to implement selective policies. Private clinics were monitored. State hospitals were under surveillance. Certain research was banned. Other research was promoted with official approval. Artists were called to meetings. They were told every work must serve the people. Exhibitions were supervised. Private galleries received unexpected visits. Non-compliant pieces were removed. Traveling exhibitions were organized to promote the new style. Sculptors, painters, and musicians had to adapt. Churches were pressured to align. A national federation controlled by approved leaders was promoted. Some pastors complied, others resisted. They were denied access to media, resources, or permits. Licenses were revoked. Sermons were reviewed. Any indirect criticism was sanctioned. An opposing group formed within the clergy. Civil registries were reorganized. Declaring ethnic origin was required. New categories were created in documents. Marriages were evaluated by local committees. Certificates were granted only to those meeting certain criteria. Couples received official recommendations. Weddings were conducted according to party-designed rituals. Street names were changed. New plaques were installed on thousands of corners. Squares were renamed to commemorate the fallen of the movement. Old statues were replaced with busts of the new leader. Symbols of the past were removed. Train stations were renamed. National holidays were redefined. Dates associated with the previous republic were removed. New celebrations were introduced. Every party anniversary was celebrated with parades, chants, collective oaths, and school events. Pamphlets with instructions were distributed. Families had to decorate their homes with flags. Public employees received mandatory courses. Their behavior was evaluated. Family backgrounds were reviewed. Participation in party events was required. Attendance at meetings was monitored. Any deviation was recorded. Files were created. Promotions depended on loyalty. Dismissals were immediate in case of doubt. Factories became part of the national labor system. Owners signed agreements. Common rules were applied. Hanging portraits in halls was mandatory. Instructions came from the Ministry of Labor. Donations to the Patriotic Fund were requested. Employees were evaluated for their civic conduct. Working-class neighborhoods were painted with slogans. Collective games were organized. Leaflets were distributed door to door. Loudspeakers were installed to broadcast speeches. Night marches were frequent. Young people carried torches. They received physical, ideological, and paramilitary training. Each week had scheduled activities. Courts acted based on simple complaints. A casual conversation or a phrase interpreted as criticism was enough to end up in prison. People learned to be silent, to nod, and to repeat. Fear became part of everyday life. Visits were rare, letters avoided sensitive topics, and self-censorship became the norm. By the end of July 1933, the country was under a single command, with a centralized voice and discourse. Parties, unions, independent publications, and associations without official control disappeared. Every element outside the project was eliminated. The internal purge, the night of the long knives. Adolf Hitler had been accumulating power for over a year, but he still faced internal obstacles that could put him in danger. One of these was Ernst Röhm, head of the SA, an armed organization that outnumbered even the German army. Röhm wanted these troops to become the country's new army, thereby securing a central place in power. The SA, which had once been useful for intimidating political rivals and demonstrating strength on the streets, had become a problem for Hitler. The military leadership would not accept a group of street militias replacing them. Traditional generals distrusted Röhm's behavior, his egalitarian rhetoric, and his insistence on a second revolution. Hitler knew this, and the tension had become unbearable. In June 1934, Adolf Hitler decided to strike first. He took advantage of an official trip to Bad Wiessee to prepare a swift operation. Himmler and Göring were already aware and supported the move. The SS and Gestapo received lists with the names of those to be arrested or directly eliminated. In the early hours of June 30th, Hitler arrived at the hotel where Röhm was staying with other SA leaders. He personally entered his former ally's room and arrested him. The order was clear: he was to be confined and wait. Shortly after, more than 100 people were arrested at various points across the country. Some were executed on the spot. In Berlin, the violence was direct. SS groups and security agents captured and executed those who were marked. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher was killed in his home, along with his wife. Gregor Strasser, one of the party's founders, was also eliminated without trial. The list included real opponents and invented enemies. At Stadelheim concentration camp, Ernst Röhm was given a weapon and the option to take his own life. He refused. Shortly after, 2 SS men entered his cell and finished him off. Hitler did not want to leave loose ends. No one was to remain as a symbol of dissent. The operation extended until July 2nd. In those 3 days, the SA was decapitated. The surviving officers were stripped of all authority. The structure was maintained as a symbolic body without real power. The SS, in contrast, gained weight and autonomy. The German army welcomed what had happened. The generals, who feared being replaced by Röhm's militia, understood that Hitler had extended his hand. Days later, they swore a personal oath of loyalty to him, not to the state or the constitution. This was a key step in creating a regime fully subordinate to his figure. On July 3rd, Adolf Hitler appeared before Parliament. He wore uniform, spoke in a severe and straightforward tone. He explained that he had intervened to stop a betrayal. He presented documents and accusations collected by the Gestapo. There was no doubt the SA had jeopardized the country's stability. Applause was immediate. No deputy dared to object. That same day, the Ministry of Justice issued a retroactive law declaring all actions from June 30th to July 2nd legal. The wording was precise. The measures taken by the Führer were in defense of the state. The text turned murders into official acts. The message was clear. Any decision by the leader stood above traditional law. The propaganda apparatus worked intensively to impose a single narrative. Joseph Goebbels ordered all newspapers to publish the same headline, "Hitler acts to save Germany." Radios repeated the official speech for hours. Pamphlets were distributed, rallies organized, and a film produced about the events. Everything was designed to reinforce the image of a leader who had restored order with a firm hand. The SA was completely dismantled. Its barracks were closed or emptied. Thousands of members lost status and benefits. Some were transferred to other offices, but without power or influence. Most were forced to return to civilian life. The structure that had once symbolized the street, agitation, and the seizure of power was reduced to memory. In parallel, the SS took on a new role. Heinrich Himmler restructured the corps as an autonomous force, with its own functions and direct access to the Führer. It became an internal security apparatus, with camps, intelligence, and operational authority. The loyalty of its members was absolute. The black uniform replaced the SA brown as the symbol of real power within the regime. Politically, the purge marked a before and after. No other group within the party dared to claim prominence. Internal differences were eliminated without negotiation. Adolf Hitler made it clear that unity was achieved by elimination, not dialogue. From that point on, meetings became monologues. Speeches became orders. Congresses became parades. The army also changed its dynamic. Having received guarantees that the parallel militia had been dismantled, the generals signed the Personal Loyalty Pact. This document became a mandatory oath for every officer, soldier, or recruit. Obedience was no longer owed to a flag or institution. Subordination was direct to the Führer without mediation. The climate within institutions changed. Public offices, courts, ministries, and universities adopted a new tone. Paintings were removed, curricula adjusted, loyalists promoted, and critics sidelined. Rumors were enough to open files. Positions were granted based on trust, not merit. Efficiency gave way to obedience. The regime's conservative allies understood the message. Businessmen, religious leaders, and provincial officials began to imitate the style. Discipline was prioritized over opinion. Committees were replaced by vertical orders. Decisions concentrated in small corps. Information was centralized in Berlin. The provinces sent reports. They did not ask questions. Within the party, mid-level cadres adopted a new attitude. Political calculation changed. It was no longer enough to be a member or participate. It was necessary to anticipate desires, interpret signals, and show subordinate initiative. Loyalties became visible. Silences too. No one wanted to appear lukewarm or ambiguous. Opportunism became a defense mechanism. The events of June 30th left a lasting psychological impact. Witnesses avoided speaking. Victims' families were threatened to maintain silence. In many cases, bodies were never returned. Tributes, public funerals, or any signs of mourning were forbidden. Even among regime supporters, fear became constant. Abroad, the news was met with concern. Some governments sent diplomatic warnings, others simply withdrew military attachés. The international press described what happened as an authoritarian turn. Within Germany, however, the reaction was minimal. Terror worked as cement, passivity as strategy. Mechanisms to silence dissent were no longer exceptions, they became valid tools. The cost of betrayal, real or imagined, was death without trial. Party morale was dictated from above. The phrase "Night of the Long Knives" became a secretly repeated formula with a warning tone. Among party cadres, it was used as a code to describe delicate situations. In the administration, it functioned as a synonym for purge. In the streets, it was a legend without details. But everyone understood its meaning. Those who defied command could disappear within hours. That episode also established the limits of what was tolerable. If Adolf Hitler was willing to eliminate his own historical companions, no one else was safe. Calculation no longer depended on ideology, but on loyalty. Leadership within the regime became a tightrope. Rising implied risk. Falling was final. From then on, decisions no longer required consensus. A signal from the Chancellery was enough to change the course of a policy, to close an institution, or to replace an entire cabinet. Capital and Reich, the business alliance. After eliminating Ernst Röhm and consolidating his control over the army, Adolf Hitler focused his strategy on securing the support of the business sectors. From the moment he came to power, economic leaders had watched with interest the regime's rejection of trade unions, its anti-communist rhetoric, and its promise of order. But uncertainty remained about the new government's real plans regarding the economy. In 1934, Hitler began to dispel these doubts. One of the first steps was to assure major business leaders that their property, investments, and operational freedom would remain intact. Expropriations, typical of other radical movements, were ruled out. Meetings with key industrial figures such as Gustav Krupp and Fritz Thyssen became frequent. The message was clear: the state wanted cooperation, not intervention. At the same time, the National Socialist Party completely dissolved independent trade unions. The old labor structure was replaced by the German Labor Front, led by Robert Ley. This new organization aimed to align workers with the regime's interests. Strikes were eliminated and wages were set without collective bargaining. The industry welcomed this labor stability. The state apparatus began organizing major public works. Highways, bridges, and canals became showcases of the new government. These initiatives not only created jobs, but also secured contracts for companies loyal to the party. Project allocation was increasingly linked to proximity to power. Aligned companies received priority. Hesitant firms were excluded. By 1935, heavy industry began to feel the effects of rearmament policy. Orders for steel, coal, and machinery increased. Armament factories received new commissions. Authorities offered contracts without tendering, with advance payments and confidentiality clauses. Private investment grew in step with military spending. Banks also found opportunities to expand. Institutions such as Deutsche Bank and Dresdner Bank facilitated loans for the new war industries. Operations were state-backed, with the state assuming risks in exchange for loyalty. Profits were high and oversight was minimal. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Economics under Hjalmar Schacht maintained a flexible monetary policy and negotiated directly with major business chambers. Hitler delegated economic management to his ministers, but closely supervised political relations. He held private meetings with key entrepreneurs and offered guarantees of continuity. In return, he demanded commitment to the regime's objectives. This pact was not formal, but it was clear: financial support in exchange for protection and expansion. Party contributions increased, and many companies created hidden funds to finance NSDAP activities. Rearmament was the core of this alliance. Military-linked industries became pillars of the new system. Aircraft, tank, and weapons factories expanded their capacity. Job creation concealed the massive diversion of resources toward war purposes. Unemployment decreased, but statistics were manipulated. Women, Jews, and forced laborers were excluded from official counts. During this period, Hitler strengthened ideological control within the business world. Leaders of chambers of commerce, guilds, and sector associations were replaced by party members. Decisions no longer responded solely to economic criteria, but also to political ones. Obedience became a requirement for obtaining contracts, licenses, or access to foreign currency. Industrial exhibitions organized by the regime became propaganda showcases presented as evidence of Germany's economic revival. Behind it, however, there was a network of dependence between political power and large corporate groups. Each project served a dual purpose: modernization and control. The economy was shaped according to the party's needs. All forms of trade union opposition were eliminated, external competition was restricted, and allies were favored. The system allowed no room for dissent. Decisions were made from above, and the scope for business maneuvering depended on proximity to the party. At the same time, economic policy moved toward the goal of total rearmament. The Four-Year Plan Office, launched in 1936, defined the key sectors: steel, rubber, synthetic oil, aluminum, and armaments. Import substitution programs were designed and joint ventures were created to develop domestic technologies. Every new factory was linked to the military effort, even if presented as industrial progress. The regime also encouraged the integration of young people into the controlled economy. Technical training programs were created in connection with state or allied factories. Indoctrination began in school and continued in workshops organized by the German Labor Front. Discipline, obedience, and subordination were the foundations of the model. In rural areas, cooperatives were reorganized. All forms of self-management were eliminated and a hierarchical structure was imposed in which party delegates decided the distribution of resources. Agricultural prices were set by authorities and surpluses were allocated to strategic reserves. Property remained private, but its use was subject to state objectives. The use of forced labor began to be organized preliminarily in this stage. Although the extensive system of slave labor seen years later did not yet exist, experiments were already underway with prisons and internment camps. Authorities assigned certain entrepreneurs contingents of detained workers under opaque conditions. This served as a rehearsal for what was to come. At the international level, the regime sought to maintain the image of a recovering country. Diplomatic visits included tours of model factories, modern stadiums, and highways. Unemployment figures were doctored, and financial reports were adjusted to show balance. The aim was to attract external credit without revealing the true military orientation of the economy. The business elite adapted, some out of pragmatism, others out of conviction. Profits were high, and maneuvering room depended on proximity to power. Many companies developed their own communication channels with party hierarchs. Donations, in-kind benefits, trips and favors were offered. The connection was direct, functional, and unchecked. By the end of 1936, the German economy was already operating under a logic entirely subordinated to the political project. There was no room for initiatives that did not align with the regime's objectives. The economic bureaucracy acted as an ideological filter. Decisions were made at the top of the party and executed vertically. The business apparatus was trapped in this structure. Racial exclusion and Nuremberg laws. In September 1935, during the party congress in Nuremberg, Adolf Hitler presented a set of regulations that formalized the legal exclusion of Jews in Germany. These provisions, known as the Nuremberg Laws, were quickly drafted by the Interior Ministry and codified on paper what had already been effectively imposed for 2 years: the total marginalization of the Jewish people from German society. The first law defined who was considered a Jew. It was based on genealogical, not religious, criteria. If a person had 3 or more Jewish grandparents, they were classified as Jewish, regardless of faith or cultural identity. 2 Jewish grandparents were enough to be labeled a first-degree Mischling. The system established racial hierarchies. Belonging was determined by lineage, not behavior. There was no way to escape that category. The label was permanent. The second law stripped Jews of their citizenship. They were no longer citizens of the Reich. They retained only the status of subjects without political rights. This meant exclusion from all representation, prohibition from public service, and barring them from teaching, judicial, or administrative positions. They also lost the right to vote or stand for election. The legal structure erased their membership in Germany's political body. The third provision, known as the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor, prohibited marriages and sexual relations between Jews and German citizens. Any intimate connection was considered a biological threat to the purity of the people. Married couples could no longer legally cohabit. Mixed relationships were treated as crimes. Human contact, not just institutional interaction, was criminalized. The state apparatus implemented the new rules. Local party offices, commissariats, schools and courts received precise instructions. Racial registries were created. Forms required declaring the grandparents' origins. Families had to review their genealogies. Mistakes or falsifications were punished. Officials became agents of ethnic classification. Special courts, known as race courts, began operating swiftly. Their role was to verify the ancestry of the accused and determine racial belonging. Decisions relied on birth certificates, baptismal records, and testimony. People endured long and humiliating trials. Some tried to prove they were not Jewish, others were denounced by neighbors, ex-partners or rivals. Newspapers published exemplary cases. Reports included expelled teachers, dismissed doctors, and business owners stripped of their enterprises. Names were publicized as a warning. The message was clear. There was no room for those with Jewish blood. Laws applied even in rural and remote areas. Surveillance was constant. Informers were everywhere. Fear of denunciation forced families to sever ties. Police were instructed to act without delay. Raids in cafes, cinemas, and parks were common. Officers identified those present and checked documents. Mixed couples were separated and arrested. Men were brought before judges. Women were interrogated. Suspicion of a relationship with a Jew was enough to ruin a career or destroy a family. Reports motivated by jealousy, revenge, or personal interest increased. Official media reinforced the racial discourse. Joseph Goebbels, from the Ministry of Propaganda, promoted campaigns glorifying German purity. Youth magazines depicted ideal Aryan families. Films included messages about dangers of miscegenation. In schools, teachers taught racial biology as part of the curriculum. Skull measurements, facial analyses, and origin examinations were conducted. Companies joined the process. Many began dismissing their Jewish employees without any legal justification. Others posted signs in their shop windows, "No Jews allowed." Public transportation was restricted. Universities denied enrollment to students of non-Aryan descent. In hospitals, Jewish doctors were replaced by party-affiliated professionals. Professional associations expelled marked members. In private life, the effects were devastating. Lifelong neighbors stopped greeting. Invitations disappeared. Shops rejected familiar customers. Social exclusion accompanied legal exclusion. Children were mocked in schoolyards. Families became isolated. Forced relocations multiplied. Many began looking for ways to leave the country, although bureaucratic obstacles made it increasingly difficult. Party leaders celebrated the effectiveness of the measures. There was talk of a cleansing of the national body. Figures were proudly displayed. Dissolved marriages, disenfranchised citizens, and jobs redistributed among party members were detailed. Exclusionary policy was no longer informal. It was written, regulated, and enforced by the structures of power. Foreign authorities watched with concern what was happening in Germany. Some governments protested, but without practical consequences. Diplomatic delegations received reports, but sanctions never arrived. The great powers prioritized European stability. Foreign businessmen continued signing contracts. The regime understood it could advance without restraint. By the summer of 1936, the system of racial exclusion was fully consolidated. The Nuremberg laws had transformed everyday discrimination into a structured, massive, and efficiently executed state policy. The legal, police, and social machinery was already in motion. The next step would be the physical displacement of the excluded. Diplomatic conquest of Central Europe. Adolf Hitler had long been testing how far he could go without facing consequences. In March 1936, he made a decision that directly challenged the order established after the Great War. He sent German troops into the Rhineland. That region, demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles, was key to the balance in Western Europe. Reoccupying it directly violated the signed agreements. However, the soldiers crossed the Rhine without resistance. France and the United Kingdom protested but did not act. Hitler's move went unchallenged. Within Germany, he was received as a hero. He had regained sovereignty without shedding blood. The reoccupation of the Rhineland was more than a symbolic maneuver. Hitler tested the willingness of the powers to confront him militarily. When he saw they were unwilling to intervene, he understood he had room to advance. From that point, he accelerated his plans. His next target was Austria. For years, Austrian nationalist groups sympathetic to Nazism had been calling for a union with Germany. Hitler, born in Austria, shared this desire. In February 1938, he pressured Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg to allow greater Nazi participation in the local government. Schuschnigg reluctantly agreed, but at the same time announced a referendum so the people could decide whether to maintain independence. Hitler did not wait for that outcome. On March 11th, he ordered the deployment of troops toward Austria. The next day, German soldiers crossed the border without firing a shot. They were greeted by crowds waving flags and cheering enthusiastically. Upon reaching Vienna, Hitler officially proclaimed the Anschluss, the full incorporation of Austria into the Third Reich. Allied leaders again condemned the measure, but once again did nothing. The annexation of Austria had immediate consequences. Thousands of opponents were arrested. Austrian Jews began to be persecuted. The Nuremberg racial laws were immediately applied. At the same time, Nazi propaganda spread images of popular welcome to justify the operation as a legitimate reunification. Hitler appeared on the streets of Vienna as a revered leader. The message was clear. His influence was expanding without facing real obstacles. After this success, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia. In the far west of that country lay the Sudetenland, inhabited by a significant German-speaking minority. The Nazi regime argued that this population was discriminated against and demanded its incorporation into the Reich. Throughout 1938, diplomatic pressure intensified. Meanwhile, pro-Nazi groups within the Sudetenland stirred the political climate. The Czechoslovak government refused to yield. It had the military support of France and had agreements with the Soviet Union. However, neither Paris nor London wanted another conflict. In September of that year, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and his French counterpart Édouard Daladier flew to Munich to negotiate directly with Hitler. The dictator demanded the immediate handover of the Sudetenland. At dawn on September 30th, the powers signed an agreement that allowed Germany to annex the region without resistance. Czechoslovakia, which was not invited to the meeting, was forced to comply. Upon returning to London, Chamberlain announced that he had secured peace. In Berlin, Hitler considered it a total victory. The annexation of the Sudetenland reinforced the perception that the Third Reich could expand without firing a shot. Hitler had managed to alter borders through pressure, threats, and aggressive diplomacy. Each advance weakened his neighbors and strengthened his image at home. The army, businessmen, and population celebrated the growth of the country without the losses that an open war would entail. With the Sudetenland in German hands, Czech industry, defensive lines, and much of its arms production came under Nazi control. Hitler did not need a full-scale invasion to gain a strategic advantage. The following year, Czechoslovakia would be completely dismantled. In 3 years, the Third Reich had expanded territorially without the need for combat. The international community had conceded every time Hitler raised the stakes. The lessons of the Rhineland, Austria, and the Sudetenland demonstrated that while the powers hesitated, he advanced. European balance had been broken without formal battles, only through military parades, public speeches, and calculated threats. Poland under fire, the beginning of the war. At the beginning of 1939, Adolf Hitler had already incorporated the Rhineland, Austria, and the Sudetenland into the Third Reich without firing a single shot. However, his ambition did not stop there. He had his sights set on Poland, a country that had regained its independence after World War I and had access to the sea through the so-called Polish Corridor, a strip separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The Nazi regime had launched an intense media campaign to portray Poland as a threat. Propaganda spoke of alleged abuses against the German minority living in Polish territory. In addition, Hitler demanded control of the free city of Danzig and a territorial connection between Germany and East Prussia. Polish authorities refused to yield. Warsaw knew that any concession would be followed by new demands. In March 1939, Hitler publicly broke the Munich Agreement signed with the United Kingdom and France. That same month, he occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, demonstrating that his word had no diplomatic value. Faced with this advance, London and Paris announced that they would guarantee Poland's independence. The message was clear: if Germany attacked, there would be war. Hitler did not stop. In August, his diplomats secretly negotiated with the Soviet Union. On the 23rd of that month, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was signed. Officially, it was a non-aggression agreement. In practice, it included secret clauses to divide Eastern Europe. Germany would obtain Western Poland, while the USSR would take the East and the Baltic states. With this pact secured, Hitler had a free hand to launch his offensive. In the early hours of September 1, 1939, German troops crossed the Polish border. The invasion was executed with a coordinated strategy combining ground units, armored divisions, and air attacks. It was the first demonstration of the style of war the Nazis called Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. The Polish defenses, though brave, could not stop the advance. The Luftwaffe bombed roads, train stations, and cities. Warsaw was attacked from the air from the very first days. The German war machine advanced quickly, cutting communication lines and sowing chaos. Images of tank columns crossing Polish villages marked a new type of conflict, fast, brutal, and relentless. On September 3rd, the United Kingdom and France kept their promise. They declared war on Germany. However, for weeks they did not conduct real offensive operations. It was the beginning of what later became known as the Phony War. Meanwhile, Poland fought alone. On September 17th, taking advantage of the situation, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. The country was trapped between two powers that had agreed on its destruction. In less than a month, the Polish state ceased to exist as a sovereign entity. Warsaw fell on September 28th. Authorities were arrested, deported, or eliminated. The areas occupied by Germany came under military administration, while the eastern region fell under Soviet control. Millions of civilians were trapped in the middle of the conflict. Executions, internment camps, and deportations began immediately. The attack on Poland marked the definitive breaking point. World War II was now a reality. Hitler's strategy of taking territory without direct opposition had ended. From that moment on, he would have to face armed and determined enemies. Even so, he trusted that his military superiority would give him an advantage. The Nazi regime was betting on a short, lightning-fast and victorious war. The invasion of Poland also revealed the nature of the Nazi project. It was not just about redrawing borders. German authorities immediately began a systematic process of eliminating political leaders, intellectuals, teachers, priests, and any figure who could represent a Polish national identity. It was the beginning of a brutal occupation policy and ethnic reconfiguration that would extend to all conquered territories. The operation ended by consolidating Adolf Hitler's control over the military and political apparatus of the Reich. The Wehrmacht demonstrated its effectiveness, and the Gestapo expanded its network in the occupied territories. The SS began implementing their methods of large-scale control and repression. Within a few days, the logic of terror established itself as a form of government in the East. For millions of Europeans, that 1st of September marked the beginning of a new phase of violence, occupation, and death. What started as an operation to reclaim a port city turned into a global war that would forever change the fate of the continent.